What can fantasy baseball managers in dynasty and keeper leagues be doing at this point in the offseason? And what is the optimal strategy to take in these formats? We'll be discussing with Mike Maher in an offseason dynasty edition of Leading Off. I guess I'm not actually sure we can call it Leading Off. I mean, it's the Fantasy Bros baseball show, the Fantasy Pros MLB podcast, however you want to refer to it as. I'm going with Leading Off, Mike.
Yeah, I think we can call it whatever we want. And if we want to just steal leading off, even though, we're leading off a Thursday evening, maybe we're leading off the second World Series game. We can just lead off whatever we want.
Yep. This is, for those listening just audio wise, this is Brennan Tuma talking at Too Much Tuma. With me is Mike Maher at Mike Maher. We're recording this Wednesday night. We're live on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern. Game 2 of the World Series is about to start. I was all ready to brag about how the bosses aren't here. We can do whatever we want. And then at 8:01, Dan Harris has a comment in the chat making me nervous, but he's not going to stick around for the full hour.
No,
he
he's
can't
not.
handle an hour of baseball talk in the offseason.
No, he can't handle an hour anytime, anything. Plus Joe just went live in Discord doing another chat. He's definitely going to have to keep an eye on that. So he's not going to worry about our little baseball podcast while he's got to worry about whatever Joe's saying in Discord.
That's true. That's true as well. So tonight, yeah, look, I'm going to be like dead honest, a little behind the scenes here. It's early in the off season. It is late October. As much as I would love
it's technically not even the off season yet.
That's true. It's technically Dan just said this is an hour. Okay, let's talk through this quickly. This might be 40 minutes, it might be 45, 50. Mike and I are just going to see how it goes, but I do think obviously it's very early and we don't want to, go too hard in the paint too early in the game. And so tonight Mike and I play in multiple dynasty leagues together. We're going to kind of talk about, that's what's relevant right now in late October is, dynasty leagues, keeper leagues, and we're just going to talk some general strategy. And then I chose 5 who I would consider polarizing players, especially in these formats. And Mike and I are just going to talk through those and we're kind of going to see how that goes. Is that what you had in mind as well, Mike?
Absolutely, because that's what you told me you had in mind, and you're the boss. I'm just here for filler, so okay. You're not talking to yourself.
Me, by the way, again, like a little more behind the scenes, me being the boss of this show has basically been begging Dan since the final episode to let us do this, basically. So that's how I walked into this power.
And also like begging me to actually show up and do it when I just keep telling you I'm too busy, but you just bugged us both enough to make it happen. And so here we are, and all the credit goes to you.
General strategy. This is what I want to start with, Mike. So like in a sentence, okay, you can expand a little bit, of course, but if someone comes to you and they say, hey, this is my first time playing in a dynasty keeper league, what is your advice? Or if, someone who maybe is listening and they've played in this type of format for years and they kind of just want to sharpen their skills and kind of refine their process, what are you telling them? What are you giving them?
So I had a bunch, and it was hard to kind of like, pare down or select only one. And I also read what you wrote in the sheet, which is pretty much what I would say. So I'm not going to steal yours. I'm going to let you say that one. Similar to what you were going to say is I was going to say, have a plan, but be adaptable. Like you definitely want to have a focus going in and not just, I think a lot of people think they can just go play Dynasty and kind of treat it like redraft, but then also, expect that, you're going to be able to like draft young players and like build your team going forward. I think you should have a clear strategy. Like, am I competing this year or am I leaning to next year? And like, don't be in the middle. And I think if someone was asking me just specifically for like a first year draft, not like a first year rookie draft, but like the first year of drafting a dynasty, I would tell that person, focus more on value and assets than like prospects and age, because veterans are going to fall, and don't be afraid to draft them. Like, you don't think you have to draft that guy in low A just because he's, the number 3 overall prospect when these 30-year-old all-stars are available, because even if things don't go well for your team, that player is now an asset in the midseason that you can flip for probably a better prospect.
Yeah, so lots to unpack there. First, for starters, I love dynasty leagues, and I think one of the most fun things I've ever done in fantasy baseball is those to start a dynasty or keep a league is that first year initial draft, because even more so than redraft, you literally you feel like a GM because you're kind of deciding, am I going to go all in this year, draft a bunch of veterans, totally ignore prospects, or am I, from the get-go going to be, playing for the future? And then, I'm sure you and I both have thoughts on those opposite directions, and, there's pros and cons for each of them. But I agree with you. I think, kind of the worst place to be. I used to call it the Atlanta Hawks back when I used to follow the NBA. Just felt like they were always like the 5 seed or the 6 seed, and they would get bounced in the first round, but they weren't bad enough to the point where they were getting a top draft pick, but they also weren't good enough to win the championship. And I do think teams can get stuck in that in dynasty and keeper league. So my number one piece of advice is to choose a direction, the goal, more so than in redraft leagues, because obviously redraft is only 1 year. So the sample size is smaller to build a dominant team. If you're really good at dynasty and you get a few lucky breaks, you can build a dominant team for a few years, and that should be your goal. And if you don't have that, your goal should be to get that. And I kind of think like the best way to do that is, you don't necessarily need to tank, but you want to be turning over older players for younger players and at the expense of, wins that season.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also a little disappointed that you made an NBA reference and literally described the pre-processed Sixers, but gave the credit to the Atlanta Hawks. The Sixers literally, and I don't want to keep saying the word literally, but they launched the process because of what you were talking about. They were like this mid-round playoff team that was always like the 5 seed or the 6 seed, and that's what spurred the process. So give some credit and respect to the Sixers, even though that process has gone horribly.
We have a Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons history lesson coming here for Mr. Mayor. So I think kind of like to your point a bit about, choosing a direction and kind of going for that. Is that something that you and your teams, and again, we're playing in leagues together, and I think you and I have had off air discussions about what we think are optimal strategies and whatnot. So that first year draft that you're doing, is there typically a direction that you prefer to go, or is it, the cliche boring answer maybe of let the draft fall to you?
So I wouldn't say necessarily let the draft fall to you, because you can't just sit there and look at your rankings like they're redrafts. You have to look at the future, and like, so there's going to be times where, maybe this 28-year-old, 29-year-old player in redraft would go 1 to 2 rounds before a player 2 or 3 years younger. And a lot of times you want to take that younger player just because you want his production this year, but then also for the next like 5 years. And I'm struggling to come up with like an example, but maybe like before this year, maybe like 2 years ago, like you probably would take Rafael Devers before Nolan Arenado, even though 2 years ago Arenado was probably, like a round ahead of Devers. But that's like an example of like a really young player versus a veteran. When like the rankings are probably close, you want to go with the young player. But I try not to go too deep into prospects, but also not have like a really old team, but just kind of like letting the draft fall to you is like such a cop out. So you can't say that, but you kind of just, want to like draft the best team possible, but also like just keep an eye on age and the future, like as you're going, which is like
Yeah,
not a fancy answer, but
I actually have a great way to phrase this, and I want to say Scott White of CBS is who gets the credit for this, who I heard say this, but he described it as always playing for tomorrow. And if you are always playing for tomorrow, then that window for you is never going to fully shut. And that doesn't mean playing for tomorrow. That doesn't mean trade Jacob DeGrom for Grayson Rodriguez. When he says tomorrow, he's not saying play for, next year or anything, but again, I play in a keeper football league, and I recently pulled off a trade where I traded Travis Kelce for Kyle Pitts and draft picks. And I know, yes, this is our dynasty baseball episode, and so far we've done an NBA and an NFL reference, but bear with me here because I just didn't have as good of a baseball reference. But that move, yes, like technically at the time, this was like a few weeks ago before Pitts quote unquote broke out. But at the time I was giving up a decent amount probably for this season. Yes. But someone like Pitts, who's so much younger, is just going to give me such a longer window, and you pick up other stuff on top of it. So that idea of like playing for tomorrow and just not wanting to be left holding the bag, I think is really important in these leagues.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That's an interesting trade in football just because of the position there too. Because like even as a rookie first year player for fantasy purposes, Kyle Pitts is already like a top 5 player at the position, or potentially could be like even this year. Like forget going forward, but like he could finish as a top 5 tight end, maybe even higher if he keeps the recent trend going. So that's an even better trade. Obviously Kelsey's like Mr. Reliable at the tight end position, but it's such a shallow position where if you're trading him in a dynasty football league and you could replace him with a, easy tight end 1, I mean, that's pretty easy. I mean, in dynasty, like the equivalent of Kyle Pitts would be someone kind of like maybe Will Smith, the catcher for the Dodgers, like the catcher position, tight end position. You trade like a top 3, like it's like trading like Real Muto for Will Smith is kind of like the equivalent there.
Yeah, and if you can do it in a way where you're trading with someone who's more so competing that year, you can get possibly Will Smith plus type thing. So I kind of call those like look ahead trades, moving forward trades, and those are the ones I always want to be making, just because I always want to have in dynasty leagues, like trading is just so much more important. So I always want to have some sort of control over the market. I mean, like Mike, you and I play in these dynasty leagues. Who does everyone want? Everyone wants Bo Bichette. Everyone wants Jordan Alvarez, like these young players that, you can, if you have them, you can make a move, but you don't necessarily have to. And if your team is, full of aging, players, it's good. And then you go to teams trying to make trades, like no one's going to want those players on your team. So that's kind of why I say that always play for tomorrow idea, because if you always have the younger players, and I'm not talking like 19-year-old prospects, as you mentioned, but if you just have like interesting players, you're always going to be able to be in some sort of control of the trade market. And I think the best example of this in like real baseball was the Dodgers before they made the Mookie Betts trade. Like they didn't have to do that trade necessarily, but because they just, they were competing, but they were also stockpiling these younger players and prospects, like they were able to make that trade. So like, I never want to feel like I have to make a move in a dynasty or keeper league, but like, I always want that ability to make a move. And because of that, you constantly need to make sure, you're getting younger, I think.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned those 2 players because I just won one of our dynasty leagues, and I have both of those players. I have Bo Bichette and Jordan Alvarez.
Yeah,
but yeah, if you're going to model, go ahead.
I know. As I was saying those names, that did cross my mind. I was like, I'm pretty sure Mike has both of these, and maybe that's why they came to mind.
Maybe, but yeah, if you're trying to model like your dynasty strategy over like or based on like a real life team, the Dodgers are like what you're looking for. Like you can maybe scrape together a San Francisco Giants roster and just hope that you can make it click the way they do. But like if you have those high end players and that great kind of like young farm system coming up, like that's what you want. That's perfect for dynasty. But it obviously everything we're talking about tonight depends on your league and your format and your roster size, and so that's why it's sometimes hard to talk about dynasty because like for the audience, like we play in 2 almost identical leagues because I copied one to create another one. But ours is 40-man rosters, 30 keepers. And so that's a pretty big roster considering you only start about half of those. But there are dynasty leagues with 100 roster spots where you're, and there's Devy leagues where, you're just rostering like low A guys everywhere. Like I kind of think of dynasty as like, you have a deep bench, but it's limited depending on like you can't just compete and have every young prospect because you just don't have the roster space to compete every day depending on your league settings.
Okay, yeah, so that's a perfect segue actually into what I was about to go into, which is kind of some of this format specific stuff and prospects in general. And again, yeah, like you said, like every dynasty league is going to be different. And baseball's like that too, just compared to football. Football, sure, there's like PPR standard, like whatever. But like baseball, there's roto and there's head-to-head categories and there's head-to-head points. And then when you add these keeper elements and dynasty elements, and like I put my favorite keeper league that I play in is actually one I share with my dad. It's 14 teams and you keep 9 players, but then you keep 4 minor leaguers. It's called like the farm system. So you have those like devoted minor league spots, whereas whereas in the leagues that we play together, there's no official minor league spots. You can have minor leaguers on your bench, or you can just have a deeper bench full of major league players. And again, like those are just 2 examples, but listeners, if they are playing in keeper dynasty leagues, are going to have even more examples, I'm sure. In our format, I think I'm going to know the answer to this, but like if it is just bench spots, how have you navigated? Again, we've only been in these leagues a few years, and I think there's a steep learning curve to figuring out the optimal strategy. But like, has anything come to your attention, just prospects wise?
I don't know if it's come to my attention or it's just kind of like become my strategy and again, this is kind of specific to our leagues and the limited bench that we had, because like I said, they are deep, but they're not super deep like some other dynasty leagues. And I don't like to wait more than 2 years for a prospect. And I know that kind of like goes against the whole like mantra of dynasty leagues where you like drafting the youngest players and like waiting to build your dynasty. But like the fail rate for some of those really young like first year players is so high. And also sometimes like even if it's successful, it could take so long for them to get to the majors. And so much can happen in the interim with your team that I just don't like tying up a roster spot for that long. So like we're not talking about like waiting 2 years for Bobby Witt, because obviously that's fine. But those really like low A guys that are going to be even like the top ones that are going to be like 3 or 4 years out, I don't like to wait for them because I don't like to waste that roster spot, especially considering it's not like 3 years, 4 years, and then, okay, he's guaranteed good. You could waste 5 years on a guy and then he's just not there. And you've wasted not 5 years of your life, but you've wasted 5 years of a valuable roster spot that's probably hurt you while you're, to compete in your league.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on that. I hope, people listening to this don't view this as just Mike and I talking about like our leagues, but we talked about, this ahead of time, but we wanted to use examples from the leagues that we play in because, I think that it can help, listeners kind of sort out, okay, my league is different in this sense, so how should I adjust? So it's like, just to provide even more context, like these leagues are, Mike said, 40 roster spots and you keep 30. I consider that dynasty. It's 12 teams. There are people who play in 24 team leagues. So the value of prospects at that point obviously becomes greater, even if you don't have, devoted minor league spots. Whereas like where Mike and I are learning, I think, is that in these 12 teams leagues is that it's not deep enough to, again, to the point where those 19-year-olds in low A are necessarily worth it holding on to forever. But I do just want to add on top of that, there are obviously people who play in even deeper leagues. Again, probably up to 24, maybe 30 team leagues where you really need to be on top of those extremely young guys because that's, your only path to getting them, because you're not going to, luck out necessarily on the waiver wire when there's nothing there.
Yeah, and even the ones that don't have those like 20 something teams, there are a ton out there, and you and I both on like Twitter got a ton of questions about dynasty leagues this year, especially coming around like draft time and that kind of stuff, where it's only like 12, 15 teams, but it's 80 roster spots. And then those low guys definitely matter because there's just you're not gonna, like in our league, like one of my other pieces of advice is like don't really worry about relievers because like that position changes so much year over year that you don't have to worry about them. In a league like that, you do have to worry about them because there's a guy out there or a manager out there with 25 relievers like on their bench. And the same thing with like prospects and like finding young players. If the rosters are that deep, you have to worry about those first year players. And then that's where the strategy of like draft picks becomes more important, because in our leagues, you stash a lot of draft picks. I trade a lot of draft picks because you see it as like a first round pick and a first crack at like a Spencer Torkelson. I look at it as a 31st round pick, considering, like play, roster, the pool of players available. And so that's an interesting way to think about it. It's like how deep your league is, whether or not that's the first crack at a really valuable player, or it's really just like a deep late round pick and you can find other value elsewhere.
Yeah. Again, just, adding in context throughout this conversation, which I know when I listen to podcasts like this, whether it's about, fantasy baseball, fantasy football, it helpful to me. So I want to add it in. This is very, we're talking very abstract right now. We're talking very macro, very big picture. But in general, I would say then, like, yeah, the deeper the leagues get, the more important prospecting and, sifting through, 80 through 100 on Baseball America midseason update, who fell off, who got added on. Like, that's when that stuff becomes more important. And yeah, especially for prospects, especially for pitchers, I think, because I have two more, abstract questions here to ask you, Mike. And one of them is hitters versus pitchers, not just in terms of prospect, but in veterans and building your dynasty rosters as a whole. Do you have a lean one way or the other?
I feel like I do, but I also feel like I change my mind like almost year to year, depending on like the league and the pool of players. I think before I would definitely lean hitting, but as the years go on and the kind of like, what we're seeing in baseball, like that kind of like a elite top tier pitching tier or pool or whatever you want to call it is really shrinking. And what's everyone looking for at the trade deadline? Pitching. And so if I can, if we're talking first year draft, I usually go hitter and load up on like two really good young hitters like Bo Bichette and Yordan Alvarez, but then maybe draft like 3 or 4 pitchers in a row and, really load up my pen of pitchers with, high end top tier guys, but then also like high end younger guys that, like a Tariq Skubal, who I wouldn't, draft that high, but, younger pitchers who are definitely on the upswing like that. I like to have like a full stable of guys like those, because reliable pitching is just so hard to find, especially like in the middle of the season. And so if you can have just like a full roster, like I feel like even in like deeper dynasty leagues, you can find a hitter to start for a couple weeks in a pinch. There's going to be guys that come out of nowhere that, you can just start for a couple weeks, even if it's like a Robbie Grossman or something. And it's so much harder to find that pitching during the season. So if you can have a deeper staff, that's kind of where I've been leaning the last few years.
Yeah, I think this is true in redraft as well. But I think, high-end starting pitchers on a single year basis can have the biggest edge. Like you look at the 2019 season, the two most valuable players in fantasy baseball were Justin Verlander and Garrett Cole, and they finished 1-2 in the Cy Young. And so if you have the best pitcher, that might give you the biggest edge. But what we see year to year is those best pitchers aren't their, end of year results aren't as sticky as necessarily the best hitters would be. So again, yeah, it comes down to, that philosophy. I would argue that, investing more in starting pitching would give you a more volatile team, where if all those pitchers hit, you're going to be looking, downright amazing, even if, half of them hit, one could argue. Whereas if you build more through hitting, you're going to kind of at least be in the mix every year. And then, you got to scrape the bottom of the barrel more so with pitchers. But I would also argue, and this is my preferred format, I call it like the Cubs model. When the Cubs had their big rebuild, it was, they built it through hitting initially. They traded for Rizzo and drafted Bryant and Schwarber and those guys, and then they bought their pitchers. They bought Lester, and they had some, savvy trades work out with Arrieta and Kyle Hendricks. And that's kind of the dynasty blueprint that I like to follow as well. I want to know year over year, I have this group of hitters that's just going to, keep me uber competitive in offensive categories, and then come and then again, like I am bigger on the like the prospects, so I try to like use those as trade bait, and then I want to buy the pitchers, whether it's before the season or mid season, which is hopefully when I know I'm competing, coming up to the trade deadline.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and it's definitely like a whether you're talking first year or like year over year, like how to build your team, like you definitely want the young hitters. I've just been, and it's almost like kind of like backwards to talk about it, because like the league that we're in that I ended up winning, like I had really deep pitching, but they almost all of them got hurt. And like I had Shane Bieber and DeGrom and Glasnow and I'm trying to think of who else. Like I think Aaron Nola, who didn't get hurt, just stunk. So I had, but like going into the season, what I thought was like a really deep staff, and ended up kind of like riding my really good hitting and piecing it together with like Ranger Suarez and Scooble and Cal Quantrill and and like that kind of stuff. So it's almost like backwards of what I was just arguing. But I think my team was deep enough that I was able to like survive that stuff. Whereas going into the year, I was like, I'm so deep at pitching, like nothing can happen that'll deter me. And then everything happened that deterred me.
It would have been so funny, just a great September leading off reference if you just started listing off Cleveland starting pitchers as, I had Cal Quantrill and Tristan McKenzie and Zach Plesac. I don't even know who else. I can't even remember at this point who else they had down the stretch. But yeah, so obviously, there are multiple paths to, having a strong team. And I get it comes back to kind of bringing it full circle to what we said up front is you just got to have a direction, I think. And even if it, is the hitting versus pitching thing, it doesn't mean you got to go 100% one way or the other. But if your team is just kind of like, oh, you got some aging stars, maybe you have one young stud, and then you got like, you're trying to compete, but you got a bunch of prospects on your bench. Like, I really don't think that is the way to go. It really just comes down to having that clear direction. And if you don't have it, like, don't be afraid to, hit the alarm button and go into full sell Astros, Cubs rebuild. I like all these pro sport league references we're dropping here, whether it's the process or the Cubs Dodgers models, but that's why dynasty leagues are fun, I think, because you can feel a little bit more like an actual GM.
Wasn't there like a post Moneyball book written about the Astros, like Astro Ball or something? I think someone wrote that.
I read it. Yeah,
There
it
you
was. All right. So again, that is just, I mean, I'm sure, like, I know I could, we could go, for even longer on, talking theoretical and abstract and things like that. But to keep us moving, because in the chat earlier, Dan, in astonishment, asked, this is an hour. So we're going to keep it moving along here. We're about, half an hour in.
He's gone.
Yeah, no, that's true. So just catching up on some comments. Bill King, he said he started calling his a keeper league rather than a dynasty after talking to us, because he only had 5 bench spots, including for the guys in the minors. And yeah, there would be, hardcore dynasty players, Mike, that look at our leagues on Fantrax and they would say, that's a keeper league. It's not even a dynasty league. I think they're dynasty, but I get how one could argue otherwise.
I think if you're keeping more than 30 players, I think it's a dynasty. But the line between the two is pretty blurred these days.
Agreed. So, all right, I picked 5 players, and we can, we'll see how much time that these guys take us. But I picked 5 players who I just thought are fun to talk about for dynasty leagues right now, and might be interesting to evaluate. And you have mentioned that you won one of the leagues we're in together, so I got to get you back here, because I know this first player you have in the Dan Harris league, which is obviously much more of a keeper league, but you have this player for a lot of money due in a salary cap format for next season. And Mike, why don't you let everyone know who that player is?
Not only that, I also have him in another keeper league and in one of our 2 dynasty leagues. Unsurprisingly, I did not win the dynasty league where I have this player in. That player is everyone's favorite player, Christian Yelich, who is a real dynasty conundrum right now.
Yeah, again, before the year, we did one of our leagues was new in 2021, and Yelich, I can't remember if he was a first round pick. He must have at least been a top 2 round pick, though. I don't know if you have, just thoughts in general on what's going on with him and how you literally are handling him in your leagues?
I'm panicking big time, especially in our league that does not have a huge budget, and I have a huge salary commitment to him based on our budget. What's our budget, like 200 something? Maybe not
240,
even
260,
240.
something like that.
Yeah, it's not, considering the amount of players that you need. I have Christian Yelich for $44, which is expensive. Like the top players go like 50. I forget what the highest players were, but like I don't think anyone went higher than like 55. So 44 is a lot of money, and it's a auction keeper league where you kind of have to like sign players to extensions, and I could have signed him to a 1-year deal and let him go, but I chose to extend him for more money, and that turned out to be probably the worst decision anyone made in our league this season. And now I have to figure out what to do. We were talking about it in our group text with Dan the other day, and I'm probably going to have to. So in our league, I have the ability to cut him, but I have to eat half of his salary. So I have to like forfeit $22. And honestly, that $22 savings is probably worth more to me than Christian Yelich right now. And that's bad.
Yeah, I was just ballparking. I know Dan was chirping me in here before about the dynasty rankings, and don't worry, they're coming. I have a whole big plan. It's happening, Dan. We're doing off-season shows. It's coming. Everyone, settle. But
he was talking about football rankings. There was a question before about football rankings.
Oh, I thought he was chirping me about dynasty baseball rankings. So
someone was asking about football rankings, and he was saying that you don't even do them.
Okay, so I do rest of season rankings. That is what we agreed to. Mr. Boss Man, but not weekly rankings. Okay, anyways, just rough draft looking at my current dynasty baseball rankings. I think Yelich is borderline outside the top 100, and I think the reason is just like physically he just isn't there. I mean, like you look back at his 2018-19 highlights, I mean, he is hyper athletic, and he has back issues, and it's not like I think one of the more underrated parts of, just fantasy in general is understanding injuries and not just, oh, he broke a bone, it's going to heal, it's going to come back. Like Yelich's back issues are looking like they're chronic. Clayton Kershaw, that's what derailed the second half of his career as well. And so that's my concern for Yelich. You look at Baseball Savant, the X slug is 382. That is hideous for what it used to be at his 2018-19 apex. And the reason I'm convinced that this is all physical for Yelich is because his plate discipline, he doesn't chase pitches, 96th percentile, and his walk rate is 98th percentile. So he's seeing the ball as well. I just think when he swings, he just doesn't have it the way he used to.
Yeah, it's any kind of like power metric that you look at for him, it's bad. Like it's all down. And I just pulled up his fan graphs while you were talking. And so his two like real breakout years, his post Marlin years, his first 2 years with the Brewers, 36 home runs, home run to fly ball rate 35%. That was 2018. 2019, 44 home runs, home run to fly ball rate was a little bit lower, 32.8%. In 2021, it was 13.2%. 13.2. So it was from mid 30s to mid teens, low teens.
Yeah. Now, all this being said, that you could make a case that, okay, he was dealing with the back this year. Now he has the whole offseason to recover. Can he get back to what he once was? You can make a case for that, and you can make a case that maybe it won't be as bad. I would argue that, just your typical, dynasty fantasy baseball manager might have that hope that he can get back to what it was more so than I personally believe. Again, this is even if Yelich improves at all. So I kind of would highlight him as a sell low. I think it would almost be a bit of a savvy move for you to just forfeit that $22 in that particular league. But yeah, those are the Yelich thoughts, I think. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on each of these players, but it is quite the conundrum that you are in, my friend.
Yeah, it is. And you know what? And I don't want to go too much longer on him, but like, what kind of concerns me a little bit about him, and is that like when he was like a younger up and coming player, like he wasn't a power hitter. And then he started developing a little bit of power, and he really hit his prime. And then he left the Marlins, and then he took off in that, that Brewers ballpark and with that Brewers team, and he broke out, and he hasn't been that guy the last 2 years. And I just don't know if he's ever going to be that player again. And, and I don't know, like, even as like an 8, he's not that old. He's like 29, turning 30, but like, as like, I don't know that he's going to get back to that 30 plus home run player no matter what happens. Like, even if he comes back fully healthy, I just don't know if he's there anymore. And are we worried that those 2 years were like outliers?
Yeah, you could argue that they would have been outliers even if he stayed fully healthy. Going to mix up the order here because, ironically enough, Riley here asked a question about where we have, Kelnick next year and beyond. And that was that was one of our 5 players here to discuss. So we'll just quickly get into Jared Kelnick. Obviously, the season-long numbers were hideous. He hit 181 with a 28.1% strikeout rate. You could argue he got a little unlucky, but even the expected WOBA was 307, which is just hideous. It's the bottom 27th percentile of the league, so you can't blame all the results on that, no matter how you dice it up. There was some positives towards the end of the year. In September, he had a 135 WRC plus, meaning he was 35% better than league average, and he had 7 homers and 3 steals in that month. So that's kind of the power speed that people were hoping for. But I don't know, initial Kelnick impressions and how you would handle him, in keeper and dynasty leagues.
Initial impressions, bad. It was bad. But he's just a baby. And so like he's not this like player that came up and like looked good and then completely flopped. Like he came up and flopped immediately. And then he went down and looked great again. And then he came up and he kind of flopped again and then kind of looked okay. And you know what that is? That's a young player who just needs more time to get better. Like he didn't have a ton of time in the minors. We had that like lost 2020 season. And to me, he was not good, but he also it just felt like a young player who needed more time. And so I'm still bullish on him long-term. And I think a lot of people still are.
Yeah. Again, so if we're giving, little piece of advice here for Yelich, I personally think he's a sell low. My take on Kelnick is that it's a firm hold. The only way that I would be looking or willing to trade Kelnick in a keeper in dynasty league is if someone was paying me April 2021 value for him.
Yeah, you're paying full price. If I'm trading
exactly.
him, you're paying full price.
So if someone, came and like, I'm trying to think of an example who he would have been ranked around at that time, again, like Bo Bichette, Jordan Alvarez type, like obviously, yeah, like I would be fine, moving off Kelnick at that point. But I really want, that high end return from him. I think, again, just alluding to these dynasty rankings a bit, I think, middle of the season, before the season, he was like a top 25 overall dynasty player. And now I just think he's a little closer to the top 50 is all. So not a huge move down. I think he needs to be bumped down a tad, but I like the way you said it. He's a baby, and the voice you said it was very nice. One more hitter on our list.
He's only slightly younger than you.
One more hitter on our list. Another player who was quite hard to figure out this year is Cody Bellinger. Obviously, like he in dynasty leagues entering this past season was like a top 10 player. Even coming off the little bit odd 2020, he did, if you recall, have the off-season shoulder injury, and it feels like he's always changing his swing. Like he won MVP in 2019, and then the whole storyline was, oh, I'm gonna change my swing now. By the end of the season, he was only playing against righties. Like he had literally become a platoon player. He made 16.1 million in arbitration this year. I was reading a piece on The Athletic just talking about the Dodgers as a whole. And they made the point, like if he was playing for a team like Cleveland or Tampa Bay, they would non-tender him. Like that is the point where obviously I don't expect the Dodgers to do that because they're Dodgers, but like that's how bad Bellinger was. And Bellinger thoughts in dynasty leagues. I actually have him in one league and I'm going to hold him, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, I'm not as out as I am on Yelich. I think there's more potential for him to bounce back. I do think 2019 was like an outlier in his career. I just don't think he's a 300 hitter. Like, I think what you're hoping for or what I'm expecting, maybe not expecting, but like he strikes me as like a 260, 30 plus home run player. And I think that's fine. I just think 2019 was ridiculous, and I just don't just like you were saying, like they were sitting him against lefties. I just don't think he's gonna be that. Just like looking at his swing and how he sells out for power, he just doesn't look like a 300 hitter. And throughout his career, that's like the only time he really was. I think he's more. I mean, even 2017, he hit 39 home runs and batted 267. I think 30 home runs, 260 average is what you're hoping for if you're holding him in Dynasty. And I think that's fine. And it feels like he's a lot older than he is because he's, been in the league for a while and he's been banged up, but he's still only like 26. And so he feels like he's Yelich's age, like he's like turning 30, but he's not. And so the injuries concern you. The performance definitely concerns you, but I'm definitely more optimistic about him than I am about Yelich. I just don't think we're ever going to see that MVP Bellinger again.
Yeah, and I think the farther away we get from 2019 in particular, like we're going to look at that as like the absolute apex of the juice ball era, especially if MLB keeps these new balls and they're trying to, relegate everything so it's normal year over year and whatnot. So I think, a lot of 2019 numbers we're going to start looking a little at differently in hindsight. And yeah, for Bellinger, I still think he has that athleticism that I kind of question whether or not Yelich has anymore.
His 2019 hard hit percentage was 49.2%, and 2021 was 30.8%. So almost a 20% drop.
That is so insane. Two pitchers I found it a little bit tougher to look for some interesting pitchers to talk about. One, I think we can go a little quicker on him, is Jack Flaherty. And I just wanted to point him out. I just think he's like a screaming buy, one in 2022 redraft leagues, but also in keeper and dynasty, because you look at he had the insane 2019 and then 2020, the Cardinals, remember, had a bunch of COVID stuff going on and he really got derailed by that. And then in 2021, he was limited to 78 innings. It was oblique and shoulder problems. But the good news is like there was no major shoulder issue. It's not like, oh my God, like, is he going to be healthy entering next year or anything? Like, he was fine by the end of the season. He's still just 26. He's been a workhorse before. This guy to me is just, a buy.
Yep. And for all those reasons you're saying, he was a buy for me going into this season. I have a bunch of shares of him, big fan of his. I like him a lot. I'm a little worried now heading into 2022, if we're talking dynasty, absolutely. I am a little worried about how many innings he's going to throw in 2022, since he only threw like 78 this year and 40 last year. He did throw almost 200 in 2019, but like, is he going to bounce right back and throw 200? Probably not. But I think if you can get 150 innings and like 180, 190 strikeouts out of him, and maybe an ERA around 3 or low 3s, that's pretty good.
You mentioned concern about the innings. I think, as we start fully going in to 2022 talk, later in January or whatnot, that you could make that case for you could say that sentence for like literally every single pitcher except like half a dozen or something, because only 4 pitchers in 2021 threw 200 innings, which is insane.
Yeah, but I mean, he only threw like in the 70s.
Yeah,
there were a ton of people coming into 2021 we were worried about, because even like the top pitchers were like through 50 innings or through 60 innings in 2020. So we were like, how many innings are these guys going to throw? I don't know. So that's another reason why they're so low. So we're building back up. But at least if you have like a guy through like 125 innings, you can project like 160, 170. Flaherty threw 78. So are we going to expect a 100 inning jump? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's something to factor in. Absolutely. And then the final guy I had here, who I think is like really interesting to value. Again, we've someone who we talked about a lot for 2022, but in dynasty keeper leagues as well, is Robbie Ray. And just because, the breakout was enormous. It was kind of out of nowhere. He's burned so many people before. I think a lot of people are going to point at him. Just the faces you're making are making me laugh. But I think a lot of people are going to point at him again because he had burned people so often before. They're going to, say that this is like the biggest sell high of all time. I do think there might be some validity to the idea that 2021 was going to be his best season of his career. That's not an uncommon thing to say. I don't think I'm a little bit more willing to buy in, especially in keeper leagues, but I'll let you go before I finish my thoughts on him.
Yeah, I think he's a really good one to talk about here because like he's burned so many people and he was so good this year and he was so bad in 2020 and we've seen like he's just been so volatile that even the people who are buying in, that's in the back of their mind. Like they're like, bad Robbie Ray is still in there, and I've seen it, and it's bad. And so he's always kind of been this like strikeout darling that people were like, I don't care if he has a 4.5 ERA, he's going to strike out 200 guys, and I'll live with the rest. And the whip is always going to be bad. Well, everything was great in 2021. Like the whip was 105. The ERA was 2.84. The strikeouts 248. Is there any way he replicates this season? And if not, is anywhere close to that still worth it? Or are we headed for major regression? And it's really hard to say because even with him, you can like do all of the research that you want because everyone did going into this year. And he just seems like he's like that pitcher who's like one bad tweak away from he's bad Robbie Ray again. And so it's really hard to kind of like even like know what's going to happen, even with regardless of how much studying you do and how much you read about him. Bad Robbie Ray's in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's important for someone like Ray and really any players understand like why a player broke out. Like, was it, unsustainable BABIP? Was it, a change in their pitch mix or what it was for Ray? It seemed like, it was like mechanical, something about the Blue Jays, whatever they did with him, they just got his mechanics fully in line and he was just able to control the ball more. And, his stuff is obviously so good. So once he started controlling it better, people couldn't hit it and it just like built on itself. So that is something where, to your point, one mechanical tweak goes wrong. He's struggling to discover it again. And, it could be, a month's worth of bad Robbie Ray starts. I should know this, but is he a free agent this year? Or is he still with the Blue Jays for at least one more year?
I will look, but I want to say he's under contract for another year.
Because that's like the type thing where, the Blue Jays are the ones who fixed him. So if he stays with the Blue Jays, even though it's the AL East and Rogers Center and all that stuff, just like the comfort level of like, if he gets off track, maybe the Blue Jays could get him back on track. You know what I mean? As opposed to if he would go to another team.
He's a free agent, but I imagine he's going to get a qualifying offer.
All right. Yeah. So I would prefer that he stays with the Blue Jays for that reason. But again, anyways, just, little game theory perspective.
Well, if he leaves the Blue Jays, I'm out. Unless he goes to like the Giants, I'm out.
Yeah. Like game theory wise though, like we said about he's burned so many people before. So like, I sometimes think, I don't know, I maybe like outsmart myself with like there's a lot of buy low and sell high talk. I kind of think like, some of the leagues we're playing in, like we've moved past that. Like everyone knows, like back in May, Kyle Tucker was a buy low. You know what I mean? It's like so you can't actually buy low on him. So like I sometimes pivot to trying to buy high if I think the player's value can go even higher, or sell low, like in the case of Yelich, if I think it can go even lower. And that's why I think Ray is so interesting to discuss, because I would almost argue he's a buy high. If someone thinks that they're selling high and trading me Ray in a dynasty keeper league, where I kind of think, one thing about him is like, again, dynasty keeper leagues, we're often talking about a lot of these younger pitchers who don't throw as many innings as we discussed with Flaherty, but like Ray is going to be like a workhorse. So like, even if there's some regression, I still think the volume he gives you, plus, hopefully the regression isn't too much. I think, I don't know, add it all up and he's a buy high for me.
I'm trying to think of what I hate like being put on the spot or putting people on the spot with like a comparable trade offer for Ray.
Yeah, I mean, we're so bad at it. We talked Hawks and Sixers, and then I made a Kelsey Kyle Pitts comparison, and
exactly.
So clearly we should have had those planned out ahead of time.
I'm trying to think like if we're talking like a young pitcher dynasty, since this is a dynasty podcast, are you trading Josiah Gray for Ray, or is that too steep?
No, I would definitely do that. I think we just talked about all the We just talked about all the, the value of prospects and younger pitchers. If I was a competing team, I would definitely, that is something that I personally would do.
So I
And
already had that as a no, and I was going to ask other lesser pitchers if I
interesting.
can get a yes. And so now I don't even have to worry about asking if you would, trade Tariq Skubal for him because I know that you would.
I wish that you had Robbie Ray in one of our leagues, and I could trade for him right now. But
I don't believe
but
that I
alas,
do. I did trade him at the deadline in our keeper league though,
okay, all right. So
but I couldn't
okay,
keep him anyway, so it was just a rental trade.
so we're a little over 50 minutes here. I think that we have, I don't want to say overstayed our welcome. I think we've stayed our welcome the right amount. This felt very natural and free flowing. And as all podcasts with you
There
always
is,
do.
sorry, as you're talking about free flowing, I'm going to interrupt you. There is a question in the chat that I wanted to mention. JP34, friend of the podcast, asked if we think teams will stick with 6-man rotations or more teams. I don't. I think we're going the other direction with 4-man rotations and, these not even necessarily like opener bullpen games, but like with the days off that are built in now, I think more teams are, going with like 4-man rotations and like a fifth starter who's more like a swing starter. And especially when you start looking at, I mean, this is not really like dynasty baseball podcast topics, but like when you start talking about how baseball doesn't have a salary cap and teams like the Rays have to get creative. And so they tried paying, building up the front end of their rotation and then filling out the rest with like, high end bullpen arms and then, those kind of like filler starters. I think you're going to see more of that. Just and what we talked about before, I think part of that is because really good starting pitching is hard to find now. And so I don't think we're going to 6-man rotations. I think if anything, going the other way.
You kill me, Mike, because again, I could go, 15 more minutes on this topic and just
I
macro
know.
level trends and baseball as a whole. But, we will see what comes of this if we are allowed to do this again this offseason. I am hopeful. I do think that anyone listening, whether it is on the Fantasy Pros YouTube MLB page or just wherever podcasts can be found on Spotify, if you follow the pod on Apple Pods, if you subscribe and leave a comment or leave a review if you mention specifically the off-season episodes, that would go a long way. Reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Too Much Tuma. Mike is at Mike Maher. Dan is at Dan Harris 80. Just letting us know that you listened, that you enjoyed it. It really does go a long way, especially when we are pushing for more baseball content during the off season. Again, JP34 chiming in saying, cool, very interesting conversation. I appreciate that,
And
JP34.
please jump in. And I haven't looked in a couple weeks, but for a really long time, the last comment on the Apple Podcast review page was after Joe left leading off, after Joe abandoned us. And someone said something along the lines of like, oh, the podcast is still really good. You really need to pull Joe back in. And first off, that's bananas. And second off, how dare you? And so someone else
So we
add
need
a
to
new
get some
review so I don't have to see that anymore.
we need to get some new reviews on there to kind of filter that down. So again, kind of going off what JP34 said, Mike, like in all seriousness, like I really enjoyed this again, more macro level conversation with you. I hope you're doing well. I know you're busy as we all are, but it was nice just to take an hour out of our evening and talk some baseball, some fantasy baseball, some dynasty leagues. I enjoyed it.
Me too. Anytime. Well, not anytime because I'm going to say no a lot, but again, at some point for sure.
Okay. All right. This is again Brennan Tuma signing off for Mike Maher and myself. This is the awkward sign off portion of the show where I am talking and I have the mouse over end broadcast, and now I'm going to hit end broadcast and the show is over.